Greetings to our audience today. My name is Larry Pearson, Vice President for Impetus Technologies, and I'm delighted to be your host and co-presenter today alongside our guest speaker, Mike Gualtieri, VP and Principal Analyst from Forrester. And we're addressing today the topic of keys to formulating an effective data management strategy in what we all have come to call the age of advanced analytics, or the age of data. And our format today is going to be a little bit of a duet between Mike and I. He's going to talk about some of Forrester and his observations on some of the keys to formulating these strategies. And I will then come alongside that and talk about some of the things that we've done to develop automation platforms and expertise to help implement and support those strategies. Many of you may be familiar with Mike. He is a popular speaker at conferences. And we also have had the pleasure of running multiple webinars with him in the past. His areas of responsibility at Forrester cover a broad list of disciplines, longer than I'll take the time to mention today, but all of them work right in the heart of what is the digital transformation movement across industry around the world. And included in that, certainly does a lot of work in advanced analytics, AI, machine learning, big data analytical platforms and tools, and the optimization of all of that to achieve enterprise objectives in becoming a real-time data-driven enterprise. So, Mike, pleasure to have you and your 25 years of experience in our industry joining us today on this important topic. Let me take a minute and cover. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah.
Let me take a minute and cover some housekeeping items. All of you will be on mute during the webinar. You'll be able to hear the broadcast, of course, through your machine's audio system. But very, very importantly, in the lower right-hand corner of your chat panel, you'll have the ability to enter questions. And we do have a place on our agenda at the end to set aside to answer those questions. We will answer as many of those as we can live and on the air. And those that cannot be answered live, we will promise to follow up and give you answers to those on email. So without any further ado, Mike, if you'd get us started here on this topic of keys to formulating an effective data management strategy in the age of data.
Thank you, Larry, and welcome everyone to our webinar. Excited to be here talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is enterprise data and data management. You know, the reality is that large enterprises have dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of applications. Like if you really inventory the portfolio of applications you have, there's tons of them. And they all originate and generate valuable data. And it's very rich data. So when you think of advanced analytics, when you think of machine learning models, when you think of the future of AI, it's data-driven. And it's fueled by this rich set of data. But there's a huge prerequisite to doing advanced analytics, to doing machine learning, and to doing traditional business intelligence, and that is to have an effective data management strategy, which is we're going to talk to you today about how to formulate that. Data reveals everything in your organization. It's a record of everything that happens, and it's pervasive across all of the business functions. It's relevant to the customer experience, operations, marketing, sales, service, finance, R&D, essentially every department. And the key is to find a map between those hundreds or thousands of data sources that the enterprise has and to the insights that all of these functions need. And that's why a data management strategy is important. Now, when we think of what is a data management strategy or what it has to do, number one, it has to continuously source new data. So both the business processes and the technical architectures must exist not in a steady state world of we have these applications and these data sources, but it has to accommodate new data sources and changing data sources continuously. So that's one of the key requirements of data management strategy. It has to capture, manage, and store all of the enterprise data. Certainly, it's preserving the history of what happened, which is critical to train models, such as machine learning models, and it has the context of the business. But it also has to capture that in real time as well, because there's many applications that need that streaming data to detect and act on situations in real time. Data management has to support numerous analytical tools. It has to support your business intelligence, embedded business intelligence, streaming or real time, and certainly machine learning. So it's not about one monolithic BI tool. It's probably about several different types of BI tools. It's probably about a special geospatial tool. It's probably about one or more machine learning platforms. So it also has to support those multiple analytical tools. And finally, it has to deliver that data to all who need it. Now, there's different forms of delivery. Sometimes that data is delivered as insights and applications. Sometimes it's delivered to data scientists who are doing, trying to build machine learning models. Sometimes it's delivered to functional parts of the business, but it has to deliver that data to all that need it. So with those as sort of the backdrop, the requirements, the needs of a data management strategy, we at Forrester have done a research report that we update continuously about how to formulate a data management strategy, and we've sort of devised 4 steps. And I'm going to walk you through those steps, and I'm going to bring Larry in during some of these steps to get his perspective. So the first one probably seems a bit obvious, but you'd be surprised. You need the right data stakeholders in an organization, and a lot of times people make the mistake of thinking that those stakeholders are just IT or just data scientists or just business intelligence, but it really needs to assemble a group of subject matter experts across the business. And that can be daunting because there's tons of stakeholders that are involved. We suggest starting with IT because IT has an overview of that data, at least from a technical standpoint. It may not have a view on all the functions of it, but IT certainly has to be involved in this. Reaching out to business divisions and functional areas, obviously, they have needs for data and insights. And create a virtual data management working group. Now, this isn't the group that's going to formulate your strategy. This is the group that you're going to assemble to figure out what the requirements are, okay? Because I went over the needs, the strategy needs, the broad strategic needs for a strategy, but you're going to need to get to the nitty gritty. So by assembling this working group of data subject matter experts, this is going to give you visibility into the requirements. So ultimately, this team has to represent what's happening now, but it also has to have an eye to the future. So you may have to also involve business development and strategy in this team as well. But again, the goal of this team is to represent those needs, because you cannot formulate a data management strategy unless you know what the needs are. And you can't know what the needs are if you don't have the right people involved. Larry, in your engagements with customers, what roles do you frequently interact with, and are there any differences between industries?
Yeah, Mike, thank you. That's an interesting question, especially because we've been at this now for, gosh, I don't know, probably 12 years since the early days of Apache Hadoop. And back at that point in time, 8 or 10 years ago, when we were working even with large companies, they were in the process of trying to figure out who should own big data. What is this thing called a chief data officer or chief data analytics officer? Should we have one? And at that point in time, in most cases, they did formalize that. Today, it's an accepted position, having raised the importance of having a data strategy to a C-level in the organization, where we go in and there is such an individual in place. Of course, we work very closely. A lot of our work today is in the area of enterprise data warehouse modernization, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And in that case, there are a number of other people who own those data warehouses, who own infrastructure, and we would work with them as well alongside important stakeholders on the business side, where frankly during this period of time, shadow IT teams and business analyst teams and so forth have cropped up. So there are a number of stakeholders on both the IT side and the business side. And I think one of the important alignments really is to make sure that both have their interests protected and represented as they come together in this team that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, that interests are represented, because if they're not represented, you're going to find yourself with a gap in your strategy. So assembling the right stakeholders is certainly the first step. The second step is to use that team to do a needs assessment. You need to understand what the data management requirements are, and to do that, you have to do a needs assessment. And that needs assessment is going to come from that virtual team. And remember, that virtual team is not your strategy team. Those are your subject matter experts. Those are the people who represent the needs throughout the organization. So what you're going to need to do here is create current business use cases for data. You may already have some of these, but the idea is to have a complete view of this. You have to understand where the business is going. And if you talk to any business today, at least most of the businesses I talk to, they have some AI strategy, and the fuel of AI is, the technology of AI is machine learning, and the fuel for machine learning is data. So usually there's some current or future requirements that are unique to machine learning. You also need a technical map of the data, right? Because you're going to have what the current use cases are and what the future requirements are, but those current use cases are being served somehow, right? They're being served somehow now. And so the technical map of the data is really understanding your current state data management architecture. And you have to be sure that whatever data management strategy that you are going to create is aligned with other strategies. It could be acquisition plans, right? I mean, that's a great way to mess things up, right? Acquiring a new company, now all of a sudden the strategy has to take into account merging data management. But many times the company is in they plan to acquire companies. So the point here is needs assessment. You're going to harvest the wisdom from that virtual team to figure out what are the use cases and what is the current technical state. So document those use cases during this phase, and certainly document the current technical architecture related to data. And you see here, there's a lot of people work that has to do with documenting the use cases, but there's a lot of technical examination of your current state as well to understand your current technical architecture. Larry, I think this is one of the activities that Impetus brings to your clients. What is the process that you go through to help them determine those use cases and help them determine their current technical state?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And there is, again, the theme with us is automate, 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 because the scope of what companies are trying to do after, in some cases, at least 10, probably closer to 20 years of experience in BI, OLAP, traditional data warehousing, they have a lot of data. And if you want to get that onto a modern data architecture, the task can be overwhelming. So we very early on decided to build an automation framework to expedite and accelerate that work. The first thing we actually did, and we found out in retrospect that it was maybe not the first place to start, but we actually started. It took us about 3 years to develop and evolve a grammar engine, which allows us to automate the logic translation of workloads running in the enterprise data warehouse as they move over to the big data warehouse. We really don't limit that to just saying bringing them over to Hadoop. Hadoop still for on-prem processing is still the most popular of the target environments that we're moving into. But in today's world of and all of the really stampede of interest in cloud computing and so forth, you'll hear me refer to that not just as Hadoop, because of many other environments now which we can leverage, which we call that the big data warehouse. We started out, we developed that grammar, and what we realized is they did not necessarily have a good transparent view of what all is running in those enterprise data warehouses today. And without a fine-grained understanding, we call it a data-driven blueprint and roadmap, it was difficult to know really how to get started. And so we actually backed up at that point then and built an automated assessment capability where we actually go in and analyze the query logs, the processing that's going on inside of the enterprise data warehouse, which is usually managed by what I call one of the usual suspects, whether that's IBM DB2, Oracle, Teradata, or SQL Server, a whole host of appliance-related platforms like Vertica and Netezza, and that then led us into being asked to modernize the entire ETL stack as well. So we've done this now for platforms like Informatica and Ab Initio and others. But the next couple of slides will give you just a glimpse of some of the outputs from this assessment phase. Like I say, the assessment alone carries tremendous value because, again, some of those most sophisticated initiatives did not have this insight. The offer that I make to you, and I hope that if you have projects that addressing data warehouse modernization that you will contact, I've got some contact information at the end, and have us show you a detailed live demonstration. This is actually one of the dashboard views that shows that we have analyzed some 15,000 queries. Having done that, we determined that 5,300 of those were unique queries. And of those 5,300, the results of this assessment said that over 5,000 of those were candidates to be completely automated for movement from whatever that enterprise data warehouse data store is over onto Spark. And you'll see at the top here, you see highlights, analysis, and recommendations. There are actually three aspects to the assessment engine. I'm showing you just a couple of slides, and you can show the next one now also, please. A couple of slides which are from the dashboard and output from that assessment exercise. But this is just, the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we do. Here you see an analysis of which of those queries were most compute intensive versus IO intensive. Here's a ranking of the most resource consuming applications running in the enterprise data warehouse today, and in addition, the same thing for users. So all of this data is what we use to create a data-driven roadmap to some data-driven blueprint or target environment, which, as I say today, is an exercise in itself. If you could go to the next couple of slides, this is a discussion of the grammar translation engine. At a high level, this is what we're doing. We're automating the movement from the enterprise data warehouse, the kinds of things that you see here on the left-hand side, whether it's ETL workloads or VTech, is you'll recognize if you're a Teradata user. Oracle users we move stored procedures and so forth along with that. And then the appliances that we have done this with, like I say, Netezza and Vertica being two examples, we are able to move those scripts as well through that automated engine over here onto one or more of the engines of choice over here in the big data warehouse side. So a couple of additional slides to elaborate this or substantiate this really. And here is, again, a glimpse at one of the dashboards relating to workload migration. In this case, this particular job included 160 queries, and we were able to successfully translate through the automation 100% of that logic. And if you could show the next slide then. And here's a before and after of using the translation notebook, which is part of the translation engine, where we show on the left a series of queries out of, in this case, Teradata, and what they were translated to on the right-hand side as live and execution-ready Spark jobs. So that's a little bit, Mike, of some of what we've done from an automation standpoint to support the not just the development, but also the implementation of some of the strategies that you're talking about. And with that, I'll hand things back over to you.
Thank you, Larry. And I think what's interesting about this as well is that, you do need to determine the requirements from business stakeholders, but they don't know everything either. No one can keep everything that's being done in their heads. So I think a tool like this, it actually looks at what queries are actually being done. So that, you make sure you don't have any gaps in that requirement. So once you understand your needs, this is where you can start to formulate your strategic options. So this is where strategy really begins. And note that we're saying strategic options because we think it's important to develop multiple options, but here's the key elements of the data management strategy. So the first one is the business imperatives. So this is, how is this strategy meeting the business need? The next element of the strategy is technical architecture, and this is really how we're going to actually accomplish this. And then the third is the implementation. Over what time period? How are we going to get this done? So for the business imperatives, the key question there is what changes do the functional areas need to make or stay the same to streamline access to that data, to share that data, to get the insights from that data. You certainly need the target architecture, and I think Larry did a very good job of showing tools that can be used to go from a more legacy architecture to a more modern architecture. But there are options, even within open source platforms. There's many different types of databases. There's geospatial databases. There's now GPU databases. So understanding what that technical architecture is also a fundamental element. And of course, the plan to implement both those business imperatives, any changes, the change management aspects of what needs to change in the business and the use of data, and certainly what needs to change in the technical architecture as well. So in a little more detail, here's how to develop the strategy options from that needs assessment. First thing is, remember I said that first team was not your strategy team? Those are your subject matter experts, but now you will need a strategy team. And it's best that that's a much smaller team, maybe 6 people max. It may have to be a little bit more, but they probably should be representatives from both half business and half technical. Because again, elements of your strategy, there could be some business change involved, and there certainly would be some technical change involved. Now, when you have gathered all of those requirements, it could look absolutely daunting. So one of the things that we've heard from companies that have massive requirements is to de-scope that. And really what that means is prioritizing requirements. If you're a large global corporation, and especially if you're comprised of multiple independent divisions, you may have to de-scope some of that work to make it less daunting, to make it practical to even move forward. You may even have to have parallel data management strategies. The third thing is to stay informed, because when you're developing the strategy, there's many different technical options, and this is a fast-moving space. It's fast-moving not only from a pure technical standpoint in terms of the types of databases, but also cloud. There's lots of cloud options. We hear all the time from companies that, used to hear it's hybrid. Well, now it's hybrid, but now it's multi-cloud. So you really have to be aware of all of those technical options, because remember, strategy and architecture is going to be about making choices, and you have to be able to understand those choices to be able to make them. And then the fourth one is one of my favorites, which is oscillate between bottom-up and top-down strategy ideas. And really what that means is looking at the nitty-gritty and using that to formulate ideas for both technical architecture and business change, but then also looking from top down. Because if you just look at the bottom up, you're not seeing the big picture. If you're looking from top down, you're not seeing what's practical at the bottom. So it's good to ideate both from the lowest of level and then from the top vision. So keep that in mind when you're assembling your strategy team, right? You're going to want sort of the big thinkers who have a broad vision, but you're also going to want to populate that team with some very technical people as well. And you know, the consideration that everyone always gives, especially from a technical standpoint, you look at what you have now, and you're like, you know, I wish I could start this from scratch. You know, you can see a clear reason why these technologies were chosen 20 years ago and how it evolved, and it all makes sense. It's usually a sensical story. Usually these decisions were rational, but at some point it gets cluttered, it gets messy, it can look like spaghetti. And so anytime you're doing a strategy, you're faced with that. Do I blow this up? Do I start from scratch, or do I evolve it? So that's part of the thinking process as well. And remember, you're generating more than one strategic option here. So you may think about a greenfield option, and you may think of a greenfield option for an element or some of the requirements, and you may evolve some of the other requirements. And certainly you should come up with, we believe, 2 or 3 strategies. Best practice is not to come up with one strategy, but to give the final decision makers a choice. And that choice may be based upon cost, may be based upon length of time to implement, it may be based upon risk, but you should have multiple strategies. And it seems daunting. Don't give up. You'll get it done. And Larry, I wanted to bring you in, especially about this best practice that we have, which is, you know, blow it up or evolve it. And, you know, that is a dilemma. You know, you have purists saying, I want to do this from scratch. And then you have some more pragmatic people saying, well, there's a lot of reasons why we can't do that, or that will take forever, or that's risky. And I know that you have a approach that you call transfer and transform. Can you describe how you're seeing customers make a decision between these two?
Certainly, Mike. And here again, this is a product of lessons learned and all the work that we've done for as long as we have in this space. I talked earlier about how we thought the first place to start on the automation platform was building that automated grammar engine, and then later saw that we had the need for assessment. We had this similar little bit of a epiphany, if you will, here, because when we got started early on in data warehouse modernization, it was all about lift and shift. And we'd go in and people literally would say, you know, do you have tools to help us lift and shift? But very quickly, smart organizations and our own consultants began to realize, oh, wait a minute, lift and shift is not necessarily what you want to do. Take what's running here in the enterprise data warehouse and just move it over, running now on more modern technologies. It may add some velocity to how quickly you can get off some of the legacy infrastructure, but it carries redundancy. It carries, you know, if it's not working well in the enterprise data warehouse, if the quality of decision making is not what you want it to be there, then that's clearly not the right approach. On the other hand, when we talk about being overwhelmed, the need to, if you will, blow it up and start all over also carries its own risk. Huge amount of effort involved, very often not even really, depending on the size of the organization, knowing where to start. So we had kind of these two extremes which presented the dilemma. And today what we've become very good at is understanding how to transfer and transform. And it starts with the data gathering that we do during that assessment phase. And most of the results of that assessment phase data gathering, as we rate and rank and analyze these existing EDW workloads, is that easily a good 60% of what is running over there really can be moved more or less as is onto the modern data warehouse. But the other 40% needs more design, needs more transformation, and it's our feeling that if we can get most of the data into the modern data warehouse environment through some of these automation tools, which do it at a fraction of what it would take to do it manually, there's much more flexibility and tools and different alternatives available to us once we get into the big data environment. So each of these is a customized roadmap based on the automation analytics in the assessment and the experience, which is now 10 or 12 years of experience that our consultants have in helping people get through this. But there is a happy medium between the two where we do leverage aspects of both, and we call that transfer and transform.
And Larry, I think the idea of lift and shift is very interesting, because you could do your assessment and you could say, gee, I don't like how this looks. I would like to evolve to this target architecture. But the way you may go about that is step one may be to lift and shift. So the roadmap may be to lift and shift to other technologies, which then make it easier to evolve to that target state. I mean, we see this in cloud migrations too, right? It was all about lift and shift of resources, but now there's a rich set of services, cloud services. So companies are rethinking how they're going to use those services. It's not just the OpEx, CapEx discussion anymore. I mean, you hardly hear that anymore. Yeah. So I think this is a really important decision that people have to make in formulating those strategic options.
And Mike, I know that you've had a couple rounds of a wave on the event stream processing. And frankly, one of the other big decisions that people are making on the transformation side, since the EDW and even Hadoop itself, from its genesis, was a batch framework for distributed and parallel processing. And today is a batch framework for distributed and parallel processing, but the other technologies today which allow us to do real-time analytics. And that's another big role or a big discussion that we have, and where we can add a lot of value is, okay, how do we now also transform this, not just to get off of infrastructure, which we may feel is limiting or costly, but really rather to transform decision-making to prepare us for advanced analytics. And part of that is real-time stream processing using Lambda architectures and some other platforms which we don't have time to talk about today, but that also is a very important part of the transformation that's taking place today.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the whole idea that streaming and batch processing in one platform, it makes sense. What people say about a batch is that batch is just a stream that has a start and an end. But those are the type of technical considerations that people need to think about when they're thinking about the technical aspects of the strategy. So I don't know. I mean, once you have those requirements, this is actually the fun part, right? I mean, it can be daunting, but it's also the fun part, because this is where you're formulating these strategic options from a technical and business change standpoint. But again, we believe it's important to have at least a couple of straw man strategies that you're going to use in the end. So, our fourth step here is to prioritize, those strategic options that you came up with. You need to prioritize them. You need to present them to the stakeholders, and these stakeholders aren't necessarily just the decision makers. And those decision makers, I mean, the office of the CDO could be coming up with these strategies, but it may be an enterprise architecture group reporting to a CIO. It may be a data management group. But whoever comes up with these strategies has to reach out and vet these options with the stakeholders. And usually those aren't just the business stakeholders that this strategy will meet those needs, but it's also technology. It might be IT ops It might be your cloud operations people as well. But vet those options with the stakeholders. And also score the impact of each strategy. And remember those strategic elements, which were the business imperatives, the technical architecture, and the implementation roadmap. So you want to be able to score the impact that the strategy will have on that and the risk. And finally, you want to make a strong case for each strategy. You are going to present these strategies as if with the passion that you believe each one of these is a good option, and that's the best way to vet it. So we've seen this be successful by assigning advocates from in your strategy team to each strategy to make the case as strongly as possible that this is a viable option and merits consideration. And ultimately, it's going to be the decision makers who make that call. Larry, I know that you've actually, Impetus and your customers, you've been right in the middle of helping companies implement new data management strategies. Can you share with us some of your customer stories?
Absolutely. We talked about the scope and complexity and easily getting overwhelmed and so forth. And this, we want to end on a nice positive crescendo that this stuff does work, that companies are transforming, and our tools are one of the ways to help do that. And here's a couple success stories that validate that. This happened to have been done in a large Fortune 20 telecommunication company that had, and it's really their term, a project for, as they called it, Teradata lean down. And through our assessment and transformation capabilities, we identified 20,000 Teradata queries, which we were able to automate completely and move across in about 5 months. And they said that manually they estimated that would have taken multiple years to do. So here again, automation is available, and it's something you want to make sure you avail yourself of. That was one of those success stories. In another case, we had a financial services company, one of the large mortgage processors, and they had decided that they wanted to phase out their Netezza appliance and move it completely 100% to the cloud. And here again, the same framework of assessment and transformation. They're actually, back to that whole process, there's actually also an automated validation step, which I didn't take the time to show you some screenshots of. But again, if you want to see the detailed demo, contact us and we can show you that, because it's a very powerful data and query validation stage, which is also automated. But again, using that same platform, they were able to move everything off of Netezza onto the cloud, automatically translate the stored procedures and SQL processing onto either Spark SQL or HiveQL. And part of that assessment exercise, we actually recommend the target query engine of choice in the target environment, and are ingesting data from S3 to Redshift for reporting and analytics. And then they replicated or duplicated what was on Netezza a snapshotting process on AWS, which was the public cloud platform that they moved all this to. So this is a couple of success stories. It may appear daunting at times, but there are a lot of tools, a lot of expertise, a lot of experience today that you can partner up alongside and leverage to make this easier. And there's a couple success stories to help validate that.
Thanks, Larry. So we hope you found these strategy elements successful. Data management strategy is not just about data management, right? It's a prerequisite to the insights, to the AI strategy, to the advanced analytics strategy of your business. So it should be thought of in that way, and I think I think that's why this role of the Chief Data Officer has been elevated and created, because there's a recognition by enterprises that data management strategy is important. So remember, assemble the data stakeholders. This isn't your strategy team. These are the subject matter experts where you're going to understand the full landscape of the requirements throughout the organization. You're going to use that team and perhaps some automated tools as well to understand what the needs are. And then you're going to formulate your strategic options. Using a smaller team, you're going to form more than one option, at least two, and then prioritize and present your strategic options, making the best case you can for each. And with that, Larry, this has been good working with you on this, and I think I'll turn it over to you for the Q&A part.
Excellent, and thank you to our audience. Generally, during the webinar, I send out a few reminders to get your questions in. This is the time at the during the webinar when we turn and answer those questions, and we'll do that next. Hopefully, you have done that, and if you have some time yet to continue to use that chat portion of your console and forward those questions into us, and it's always one of the highlights of every webinar, and we'll begin now to look at and answer those. We've had a number of different very interesting questions come up. In addition, you'll see on your console that there are some polling questions, some final polling questions that we'll share with the audience. And it's very important also that we do get your feedback on the webinar experience, so you have an opportunity to offer us that feedback there. We'll move now to some of the questions that have come in. There are a number of very interesting questions. What you'll also see on the slide here, though, are a couple of things that I might point out right now before we dive into those questions, and that is that for additional information, particularly encourage you that if you have a modernization project in place, that you contact us and actually see the full live demonstration of the automation framework. I think you find it quite interesting. In addition, coming up here in September, we will be at the Strata Data Conference in New York. Would love to have you visit us there. If there are any other questions that you may have that you didn't get a chance to have answered during today's session or chose not to send through the console for discussion now, you can reach out to us, inquiry@impetus.com. As I mentioned earlier, all of these engagements end up being quite unique depending on the requirements, the current landscape of infrastructure, the whole mix of hybrid multi-cloud versus cloud-based options, and so that's always an interesting exercise for us. And you can contact us, and we can interact with you around some of the uniquenesses that you may be facing. That brings us to some of the questions that have come in. And Mike, I see that I have several around a very popular topic. I'll just read one of them, but there's several that made some reference to this. We hear a lot of talk about a single source of truth, and that is a challenge for us in today's environment. Is it a realistic goal, and what are some keys to achieving a single source of truth for our business? And Mike, if you would take that one on.
Sure. Larry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure we still had audio. Yeah, I mean, single source of truth essentially means we need to know what's true at any given time about a customer, about our operations. So it is essential, and it's essential to maintaining trust with customers especially, right? I mean, imagine if you placed an order and then, you looked it up again and it was different, or it wasn't, you updated it, but the update had some sort of lag. So single source of truth is essential. But having said that, though, it's not always essential. So a good example of that is, from an operational standpoint, you may want to know directionally, is sales increasing? Is it decreasing on a certain item? So that doesn't necessarily have to be up to date. So you have to balance what is the absolute requirement for single source of truth, and that's especially important to customers, versus operational analytics and what's practical. So truth in the sense of data and analytics is time-based. There's times when you need absolute single source of truth up to the minute, but there's times when there can be a lag. So it's not an all or nothing proposition. There's different technologies that can help you do that. The challenge in updating a single source of truth is that a large enterprise, and even medium-sized enterprises, have dozens or hundreds of applications. And so that truth needs to get replicated often to different applications, and that makes it a challenge. So there's streaming, there's messaging, there's data virtualization technologies that can assist and make that happen.
Excellent, thank you. A couple other questions have come through. The next one we spoke about a little bit live during the webinar, and some other folks would like some further clarity on that. And it says most of our EDW workloads today involve batch processing of transaction data that gets pushed to the enterprise data warehouse for OLAP, BI query processing, and SQL query processing, and so forth. And you talked about the importance of having a real-time or streaming capability. Any other advice or comments that can help us understand how we can actually blend those two together? Because as you just said, in some cases, real-time is required, and other times it is not. And anything in all of your work with the Wave and the different vendors that supply streaming analytics platforms that you may want to offer additionally to what we've already covered there?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because I certainly don't want to imply that real time is better than non-real time, because case in point, machine learning. So most machine learning models are trained on historical data. That's how you create a recommendation engine based upon what's happened 3 months in the past, right? So that's not a result you need immediately, and you certainly need historical data for that. On the other hand, if it's an IoT application, for example, that's looking at the maintenance need, perhaps a train is going to slow down or a machine is going to shut down. That's more of a real-time need. So both of these are essential, and streaming doesn't take the place of EDW, but you need an entire data architecture that includes both. I mean, I think we might have mentioned Lambda architecture, and this is one of the architectures where you have a speed layer and you have a batch layer. So both of these are essential, and when you're creating a data architecture, you need you need to harmonize both of these architectures together.
Excellent. Thank you. We also have a great deal of experience with exactly that, and almost every engagement we go into now involves some implementation of a Lambda architecture. So again, if you want to shoot us questions here under inquiry@impetus.com, we can follow up with you, understand exactly your particular situation, and help you kind of sort through how that blending and implementation process takes place. Another question, several questions pertain to what you described as the dilemma of blow it up versus evolve it. And I had covered a little bit in that section of your presentation on the assessment phase and all of the data-driven analytics that we provide through these dashboards as output from that assessment phase, which helps to guide that, and ultimately our approach, which we call transfer and transform. But there's several questions here, just wanted you to elaborate that a little bit better, and what they're really wondering is there any body of experience yet, and I shared our experience when I went through transfer and transform, but any thoughts in what you're seeing in large enterprises as to kind of how they oscillate back and forth on that, and are most of them moving the needle over to the blow it up, transform, what we call a re-engineering side, or are they tending to do some form of a modified lift and shift? Anything else you want to add to that? It seems that particular topic generated a lot of thought.
Well, Larry, if you like James Bond and you like action movies, I would suggest you just go with blow it up if you like explosions. So, No, I would say that the evolutionary process in most enterprises is more likely. But here's what I'll add to that. I mean, it's very important to look at that because everyone does it. Like even a software developer working on a very focused thing, you're always faced with a change to your code. I've got a new requirement in this code. Should I rewrite it? In coding, it's refactoring, right? Or should I just sort of tack it on? And it's going to be messy. So this is the exact decision that we're talking about in your data management architecture. Most enterprises can't blow it up. It's too complicated. But what they can do is they can blow up pieces of it. So and this sort of relates to the oscillate between top down and bottom up. So they may look at the overall data architecture and they say, well, I can't touch that. I can't touch that Oracle database because it's attached to this. But I can totally re-architect this data warehouse. And that sort of leads us to sort of the lift and shift strategy. So there's the overall refactoring of the architecture, which is really hard to do with a complex data architecture in a large enterprise. But you can look at a specific aspect of that and say, should I blow this up or should I evolve this, right? And so oftentimes you can take pieces of the architecture and you can replace pieces of that. So that's what we're seeing happening in most enterprises. And this kind of relates to something you said before about in your customers, you're seeing the need for both real-time and batch, and especially a move from certain workloads are becoming more real-time. I'm seeing that too. Like when I get inquiries from the buyers, that's what they're trying to do. They've identified the real-time needs because formerly those were all batch needs. So a lot of the lift and shift comes from creating a data warehouse environment that also has real-time capabilities.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. We have a few minutes left. There's another question that came in here saying we are looking to move off Netezza to Microsoft Azure SQL Data Warehouse Cloud. Obviously, Azure is cloud. It says, I didn't hear Azure mentioned. Are there limits to the databases or clouds in your support? And I'll take that one on. The intent today was to provide thought leadership methodologies, tools, and expertise that actually are public cloud independent. So the engine that you saw where you may have heard me reference AWS because a lot of the work we've done has been on AWS. We do an equal amount of work on Azure and more recently the Google Cloud Platform. So nothing that you saw today would exclude any of the three major public cloud options. And in fact, we're currently working with several clients and prospects partnering with Microsoft on Azure. Databricks also often plays into that, and we are partners with both Microsoft and Databricks and have a number of Azure engagements in place today. So there's no limit to what we showed you today that would be imposed by the public cloud provider, a particular public cloud provider that you might choose. We do have, Mike, a number of questions about the cloud data warehouse and kind of how the cloud, the interest in cloud, these public cloud platform offerings, how that begins to play into all of this. The question that we just had starts to get into that. I do have a couple of questions here that I'm going to combine into one, make some comments from our perspective, and then toss it over to you, and that will likely, looking at the clock, here be the last question we will address. And as I say, this is where are the payoffs coming from cloud data warehouse? What are the major trade-offs in moving to cloud? And our experience is that almost every engagement we get in today involves the cloud in some way, shape, or form, either multi-cloud or some form of hybrid, or companies now also are looking at strategies to move all of their analytic computing to some kind of a cloud base. In terms of the major trade-offs that we see them looking at, first and foremost is the allure of having an elastic infrastructure. And so if you compare that to the environment they're in today with DevOps and managed services, which they're running themselves, and the task of trying to, size their hardware and infrastructure for peak loads versus averages and all of that, and all of the DevOps and configuration planning and workload forecasting and so forth that goes with that, there's a real allure of being able to get into a completely elastic infrastructure, and that certainly is one of the big trade-offs that people are looking to gain, along with a reduction in the costs and effort around DevOps and managed services. And then from a balance sheet point of view, allows them to shift CapEx to OpEx. Now, from a trade-off standpoint, some of the things that they're concerned about are, number one, vendor lock-in. So more and more we're working with them on exactly that. How do I maybe implement a multi-cloud or completely hybrid environment? So there are concerns on the other side of the trade-off list of trade-offs about not getting into a vendor lock-in situation. In addition, it's not uncommon that they end up underestimating the costs of running on this elastic infrastructure. So we are seeing for companies that have shifted to the cloud and have not really maintained a certain rigor around managing those workloads, understanding how that metering works when that monthly invoice shows up from the cloud vendor. In our experience, a little bit of sticker shock on that, and having to put controls in place as to what's running in the public cloud. And lastly, for those companies that are in vertical industries like big box retailing or healthcare, we quite frankly are seeing a lot of concern about AWS. In most cases, companies in those verticals are not moving to AWS and are looking to move to Microsoft or Google Cloud Platform, just because of the business models that they've seen Amazon roll out that actually threaten those industries as a competitor. So those are some of the trade-offs that we have seen. Mike, if you've got a comment you'd like to make, I'm sure that we'd like to hear your answer on that as well.
Larry, I've seen the same thing. I mean, it's not a binary. Cloud is not a binary decision. It's like, do we go cloud or not? It's hybrid. Now it's multi-cloud, and it really comes down to the situation of the enterprise. I mean, if it's a startup, you're going to go cloud, right? You're not going to do a data center and do all that. You're going to go to cloud. But if you're already a large enterprise and you have a private data center or a colo or whatever, I've been hearing the same thing. The expense, huge bills, right? Cloud is very economical for elastic workloads. And a lot of analytics actually happens to be elastic, like if you're training a machine learning model. So a lot of the largest of companies are now trying to balance that in more of a hybrid situation. So I agree. It's definitely not binary. It's like cloud or not cloud. There's definitely factors. I mean, having said that, a lot more people are interested in the cloud. There's a lot of migration to the cloud. There's a lot of advantages from an innovation standpoint in the cloud as well. But I think the largest of enterprises definitely have to think about how they can optimize, at least operations people have to optimize the cost. Data architects have to think about, well, how do I make this seamless? We may have a complex, we may be multi-cloud, we may be hybrid, but how do the users, the analytical users, not have to worry about that? So that's yet another factor. I also hear a lot about the lock-in in cloud. So, and this is where a lot of the vendors and service providers, this is where they're spending a lot of effort too, is to make it very easy to move from one infrastructure to another. The cloud wars continue, especially the pricing wars, GCP, Azure, IBM to some extent, certainly AWS. So there's a lot of fluidity in public cloud. It's not settled yet. So that has to be a key element of your data management strategy is hybrid and multi-cloud.
Great. Thank you again, Mike, for your time today on this webinar and for helping us answer these questions that came in. There was one last question that came in that I'm going to touch briefly on. It says the discussion is very much about architecture and technology. Shouldn't the data strategy go beyond and also include data governance, data literacy, analytics, roadmap, metadata management, et cetera, et cetera? And the answer to that question is a resounding yes, and a resounding absolute. Absolutely.
Yep.
We could actually do a whole webinar just focused on that, but a good deal of the time that we spend in these projects is exactly on that. Mike, if you have a final comment on that, I'd welcome you to jump in.
Yeah, no, I agree with the questioner. Those are absolute elements, and I think given our time frame, we were a little higher level to that, but absolutely need to drop down to data governance and metadata management. All of those elements are key to the strategy as well. And that's sort of the oscillation point too, is to go low level and high level on those elements. So important elements of the strategy as well.
Excellent. So whoever had asked that, if you want to send us a note, inquiry@impetus.com, I'd be happy to make sure and see that we get our architects online with you and people that are out there working on these and take you through a whole discussion of how we begin to address that, since time today did not allow. You see on your screen now a way to contact us. If you're going to be at Strata, we'd love to see you there. In addition, if you would take a minute as we close our webinar out today, and give us some feedback here on this feedback form. And thank you again, and have a great remainder of your day.